"Get out, you ragged old man." In the midst of the state funeral of General David Wallace, a guard shouted straight into Eli Center's face, shoving the old man hard so that he stumbled and fell onto the wet stone ground. No invitation, no rank insignia, only a twisted piece of metal torn from his hand and thrown to the ground like trash. And in that very moment, everyone thought it was over, an anonymous nobody crushed by power, right in the middle of national honor. But only a few seconds later, in a brief instant, the entire cemetery fell silent. A military motorcade rushed in, a 4-star general stepped out, and he stood at attention, saluting the very old man who had just been humiliated. Because Eli Center was not a beggar, he was the shepherd, the man who once saved an entire special operations unit, and the very general lying in the coffin. The piece of metal that had been thrown away was not trash, but proof of a truth buried for 40 years. If you were Eli, would you bow your head in silence before abuse of power, or stand up even if it meant paying the price? If the honor of the dead were trampled, would you turn away, or step forward? If you want to know what happens next, subscribe to the channel right now, and leave a comment. This story is not over yet. The entire nation seemed to hold its breath when the news of General David Wallace's death was broadcast across every media channel. Flags were lowered along the major avenues. Screens in cafes, train stations, and hospital lobbies repeatedly displayed the familiar image of the general with his resolute gaze. People spoke of him in lowered voices, as if afraid of shattering the heavy atmosphere that blanketed everything. On the morning of the state funeral, a fine drizzle fell, cold enough to seep into the skin, dense enough to blur the boundary between the gray sky and the silent ground. The military cemetery had been sealed off since early morning. Metal barricades were erected in multiple layers, each entrance guarded by soldiers standing at attention, their eyes scanning every face. The guest list was checked meticulously, every pass examined, every step following a carefully calculated order. Inside, the flag-draped coffin rested at the center of the honor guard, wreaths arranged neatly, the scent of damp earth mingling with the cold metallic smell of ceremonial rifles, creating a sensation difficult to name. No one spoke loudly, even whispers faded quickly. Amid that orderly stream of people entering, an old man appeared from the outside. His posture was unhurried, his steps neither rushed nor hesitant. Rain clung to his shoulders, soaked into his hair, leaving droplets sliding down a face deeply marked by time. He stopped at the security gate, waiting his turn like everyone else, his gaze fixed toward the interior of the cemetery, where the flag fluttered faintly in the cold wind. The guard in front of him kept his voice flat, strictly procedural. Invitation. The question was brief, devoid of emotion. The old man reached into his pocket, his movement slow, and pulled out a worn wallet. He opened it, flipped through a few compartments, paused for a beat, then looked up. "I don't have one," he said calmly. "Tell them that Eli Center has arrived." The words dropped into the cold air as a small pebble tossed onto a still surface. The guard hesitated slightly, studying him more closely. A young soldier beside him glanced over, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "A friend of the general?" he asked, his tone edged with mockery. "Who do you think you're kidding?" A few other gazes turned toward the old man, carrying a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The Eli Center did not answer immediately. He looked straight ahead, toward the line of tall trees that partially obscured the view of the central area. "I came to see my friend off," he said at last, his voice low, no louder than the rain. The words were simple, not meant to persuade, as though the fact spoke for itself. The soldiers exchanged looks. Someone shrugged, another shook his head. A faint sense of disdain passed through the air, subtle but clear enough for Eli to feel. To them, he was merely a name absent from the list, an exception that had no right to exist on a day when everything was meant to follow protocol. Another guard stepped half a pace forward, his tone firmer. "Please leave the area. Today, only those with invitations are allowed inside." Eli remained where he was. He did not argue, nor did he step back. His eyes darkened, as if a memory had been stirred. The rain continued to fall, quietly clinging to the hem of his coat. To hands hardened by years, he drew a slow breath, as though to keep his voice steady. "I promised him," he said. "Just a few minutes." A soft laugh came from behind. The young soldier from earlier shook his head, clearly amused by the situation. "A promise to the general," he repeated, stretching the words. "That's a good one." The mockery needed no further explanation. It was already plain in his eyes. The atmosphere at the gate began to tighten. A few people behind them stirred, some showing irritation at the slowed line. At that moment, from a distance, an officer approached at a brisk pace. His stride was decisive, his face openly impatient. On his shoulder rested the insignia of a first lieutenant. His name was Ryan. Ryan stopped in front of the group of guards and glanced over Eli once. "What's going on?" he asked sharply. One of the soldiers gave a brief report. Ryan turned back to Eli, irritation clear in his eyes. "Old man, today is a state funeral," he said. "This is not a place for made-up stories." Eli met Ryan's gaze, direct and unflinching. "I'm not making anything up," he replied. "I'm here because of David Wallace." The way he spoke the general's name without a title caused a few people nearby to stir slightly. Ryan frowned and stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing to the point where they could feel each other's breath. "Do you know who you think you're talking to?" he growled. "I don't have time for this farce." A cold gust swept through, making the flag atop the tall pole whip more violently. The national anthem echoed from the speakers, slow and solemn, forming a strange contrast with the tense exchange unfolding at the gate. Eli stood still, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his shoulders slightly bowed under the rain. He did not look at Ryan for long, only briefly shifting his gaze toward the inside of the cemetery, where he knew his friend was lying. Ryan drew a breath, as if restraining his irritation. "Leave," he said, each word distinct. Right now, his voice was not loud, but it carried far enough for those around to hear. It was not merely an order, but an assertion of authority from the man controlling the gate that day. Eli did not move. The silence stretched for one beat, then another. In that moment, the rain continued to fall, the anthem continued to play, and thousands inside the cemetery remained standing at attention before the flag-draped coffin. Only here, before this cold gate, an invisible line was being drawn between honor and procedure, between memory and authority. Ryan stopped directly in front of Eli, his gaze icy. "Old man," he said, his voice lowered but heavy with threat. "I don't have time for this nonsense. Leave now." Ryan stood in front of the Eli Center like a cold wall that had just been erected. He did not need to raise his voice to impose authority. A slow sweep of his eyes from the old man's head down to his feet was enough to express contempt. That gaze lingered longer on the worn shoes darkened by rainwater, then on the jacket frayed at the shoulders. Ryan curled his lip. "You look more like a homeless man," he said, his voice dry, loud enough for those standing nearby to hear. The words did not sound like a question but like a conclusion already decided. A few young guards let out brief chuckles. Some turned their faces away, but no one objected. Eli felt the cold seep up from the wet stone ground into his feet. He raised his head and looked straight at Ryan, his eyes neither pleading nor defiant. "I do not need to go in for long," he said, his voice even and low. "Just a greeting." Ryan laughed, a short, sharp sound. "A greeting," he repeated, then tilted his head, as if weighing something utterly ridiculous. "Do you think this funeral is a marketplace, where you come and go whenever you want?" His voice rose slightly, carrying the irritation that was building. To Ryan, Eli was not just a man without an invitation. He was an obstacle, disrupting order on a day when everything was supposed to be absolutely perfect. Eli pressed his lips together lightly. He heard every word, every inflection in Ryan's voice. Each sentence was like a thin but repeated cut, aimed directly at what little patience remained. He knew he was standing on a fragile boundary, where a single wrong movement could send everything sliding in another direction. "I came because of a promise," he replied, his voice still steady. "That is all." Ryan waved his hand, the gesture decisive. "That is enough," he said, turning to the guards. "Get him out of here." The command rang out clearly, allowing no argument. One guard stepped forward half a step, then stopped, his eyes flickering with hesitation as he looked at Eli. But Ryan noticed the pause at once. "Follow orders," he snapped, his voice more urgent. "This is not the time to be soft." The air in front of the gate seemed to thicken. Rain fell steadily, each drop splashing up from the stone surface. As the guards' boots shifted, Eli stood among them, sensing the invisible circle closing in. He took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling beneath his soaked clothes. "Do not make things worse," he said, this time his voice lower, carrying something like a restrained warning. Ryan stepped closer. The distance between them was now just enough for Eli to see every fine crease at the corner of the young officer's eyes, born more of tension than of age. Ryan bent his head and spoke softly, each word sharp. "Worse," he whispered. "You are a stain here." The words were released gently, but carried a clear intent to wound. They were aimed not only at Eli, but at what he represented, something Ryan believed had no place at this solemn state funeral. A few people behind them began to murmur. Some looked irritated, others curious. but no one stepped forward to intervene. Ryan's power at that moment did not come from the rank on his shoulders, but from the shared silence of those around him. Eli felt it, felt the loneliness closing in around him. A young guard stepped up, his hand resting lightly on Eli's arm, the motion still hesitant. His eyes flicked toward Ryan, as if waiting for a signal. "Take him out," Ryan repeated, his voice firm. The young guard swallowed, his hand tightening. The hesitation vanished under the weight of the order. Eli did not pull his arm away. He let it be, feeling the gentle but resolute pull. In that moment, old memories flickered through his mind, blurred images of a distant time, when orders were given in a similar tone, and people were dragged away not because they were wrong, but because they did not belong to the order being protected. He clenched his hand inside his coat pocket, his fingers touching something cold and hard. His breathing grew heavier, slower. Ryan stepped back half a step, watching the scene before him with a cold satisfaction. "See," he said, his voice returning to normal. "It is that simple." He turned to look at the people around him, as if to affirm that he had handled a disruptive situation correctly. Eli moved with the pull, each step heavy. He said nothing more, but in his mind echoed a silent question about when a promise became a luxury, when the memory of a friend was placed behind access cards and printed lists. He lowered his head, rain falling onto his eyelashes, hiding the gaze that was gradually darkening. When they had taken only a few steps, Eli's hand inside his pocket slipped slightly. The cold object no longer stayed in place. A soft clink sounded, very faint, but enough to break the rhythm of movement. A twisted piece of metal fell onto the wet stone ground, rolled half a turn, then stopped, reflecting the pale gray light of the rainy sky. All movement paused in that brief moment. The young guard holding Eli's arm bent down to look. Ryan turned his head back, his gaze immediately drawn to the object on the ground. No one spoke right away, but everyone's attention converged on that small piece of metal, as if it had just opened a door that no one yet realized they were about to step through. A piece of metal lay motionless on the wet stone ground, small and warped, as if it had just been torn from a story no one here wanted to hear. Rainwater pooled on its scarred surface, reflecting the pale gray light from the sky. The silence stretched for a beat, then a young soldier bent down and picked it up. He held it between two fingers, turning it slightly, his expression caught between curiosity and confusion. "What is this thing?" he asked, his voice not yet able to hide the carelessness of youth. Ryan stepped forward, glancing at the tiny object, as one would glance at something not worth bothering about. "Battlefield trash," he said, his voice dry and curt. The words fell very lightly, but enough to draw a few chuckles from those around. In that moment, the piece of metal was no longer an inanimate object. It became a pretext for mockery to be unleashed, legitimized by the authorities standing guard at the gate. Eli followed the movement of that hand, his gaze settling on the metal fragment as if looking at a piece of memory just dragged out of hiding. He took half a step forward, his voice low and firm. "Put it down." The two words were spoken clearly, not raised, yet they carried a weight that made several people hesitate. Ryan turned his head, narrowing his eyes at Eli. The corner of his mouth lifted, the smile carrying an unmistakable challenge. "You giving me orders?" Old man Ryan asked, drawing out his voice as if savoring each word. He raised the piece of metal a little higher, letting the rainy light shine directly onto its rough surface. "Who do you think you are?" Eli remained still. He did not move forward, nor did he step back. "That is the bullet fragment Wallace left behind," he said. The name David Wallace was spoken slowly, without any title attached, but it was enough to make the air around them sag. A few guards glanced at one another. The mockery on their faces suddenly faded, giving way to hesitation. Ryan let out a thin laugh. "Forging insignia during a state funeral is a serious crime," he replied, his voice colder. "You know that, don't you?" He rotated the metal fragment in his hand, his thumb sliding over the dents and sharp edges. The motion was slow, deliberate, as if he were dissecting a fake piece of evidence in front of a crowd. Eli felt his jaw tighten. Each rotation of the metal fragment was like a whirlpool pulling him back to earlier days, when the sound of metal striking flesh was not something to laugh about. He looked at Ryan's hand, a hand still young, one that had never trembled from blood loss, never held another person tightly to keep them from slipping across the line between life and death. "Don't touch it," he said, his voice lower, heavier. "That is the memory of the deceased." Ryan tilted his head, irritation clear in his eyes. "Memory," he repeated, then laughed louder. "You carry memories around like this." He brought the metal fragment closer to his eyes, as if checking the authenticity of a cheap item. "Here, What has value is an invitation, is regulation, not the stories you make up. A few people behind them began to whisper. Some lowered their heads, avoiding the scene before them. Others looked at Ryan with approval, as if he were doing exactly what his duty required. That quiet division made Eli feel even more sharply, the isolation closing in around him. He said nothing more, but his hands clenched inside his coat pockets until his knuckles tightened. Ryan continued to spin the metal fragment, this time faster, more carelessly. "You know what's funny," he said, his tone mocking. "A lot of people have stood at this gate and said they were friends of Wallace." He stopped and looked straight at Eli. "They're all the same." Eli lifted his head. His eyes were neither blazing nor pleading. They were dark and deep, like the surface of water after a long rain. "He kept it," Eli said slowly. "He kept it to remember that he was still alive." The words were not meant to persuade Ryan, but rather spoken to himself, to a memory being torn apart, right in front of him. Ryan snorted. "I've heard enough," he replied. "Here, the memories of the dead have no value." With that, he released his grip. The piece of metal fell onto the stone ground, bounced with a dry, sharp sound, then rolled a few turns before stopping at the edge of a puddle. That sound rang out more clearly than any words, like a forceful period placed at the end of the conversation. Eli closed his eyes for a brief beat. An image of Wallace flashed by, not in uniform or among an honor guard, but in a very different moment, where gunfire and dust filled the sky. He opened his eyes and looked down at the metal fragment at his feet, rainwater clinging to it, obscuring the marks that only he and Wallace had ever understood. His jaw tightened further, his breathing grew heavier, but he remained standing. Ryan stepped back one pace, as if he had said all that needed to be said. "Take him away," he ordered, his voice decisive. The guards moved forward, but this time their hesitation was more obvious. Their eyes flicked to the metal fragment, then to Eli's face. A heavy silence settled over them, carrying the sense that something had just been crossed, an invisible boundary just broken. Eli no longer looked at Ryan. He bent down slowly and picked up the metal fragment. The movement was careful, as if afraid of hurting something that had already suffered enough. When he straightened, the piece of metal was held tightly in the center of his palm. Rainwater mixed with the warmth of his skin, making it look as though it had just been awakened from a long sleep. Ryan watched, irritation flashing in his eyes. "I told you already," he growled. "That thing has no place here." Eli did not respond. He simply stood there, the metal fragment resting firmly in his hand, like a silent act of defiance against the authority just put on display. The air before the gate grew thick. The rain still fell. The national anthem still echoed from afar. But amid those familiar sounds, a sense of unease began to seep in. That small piece of metal, the thing just called trash, had left a crack in the seemingly unshakable order of the state funeral. How great a secret do you think an anonymous person can carry? Do not leave. The truth has only just begun to reveal itself. The rain kept falling steadily, a little heavier now, as if the sky itself were growing impatient. Eli stood before the cemetery gate, a cold piece of metal resting in his palm, its rough texture pulling him back into the present. Ryan's eyes flicked over the metal fragment and then settled on Eli's face, his gaze no longer bothering to hide its irritation. He stepped forward, shoulders dipping slightly, the movement quick and rough. The shove came without warning, strong enough to make Eli stagger a step. The old hat on Eli's head fell, rolling across the wet stone ground, bumping lightly, before coming to a stop near the base of the flagpole. The flag high above jerked sharply in the wind, producing the sound of fabric cutting through the air, sharp and dry. A few people nearby inhaled quietly. Some turned their faces away. The shove was not strong enough to knock Eli down, but it was enough to lay bare the raw contempt of the one holding power. Eli lowered his head by instinct, closing his eyes for a very brief moment. In that darkness, an old oath rang out, soundless yet unmistakably clear. "I swore never to hit anyone again." The vow had been made in a makeshift field room thick with the smell of gunpowder, when he believed he had left war behind forever. His breathing slowed, grew heavier, as if it had to be dragged across a long distance before reaching his chest. He opened his eyes. "Don't push me," Eli said, his voice deep and low, clear enough for Ryan to hear. It was not a plea. It carried the restraint of someone accustomed to standing at dangerous boundaries and fully aware of the consequences of crossing them. Ryan let out a harsh laugh. "You dare threaten a national officer," he shouted, his voice rising, drawing the attention of those around them. A few guards shifted their positions, their expressions tightening. Ryan stepped closer, grabbed Eli by the collar, and yanked hard. The wet fabric wrinkled in his grip. "Kneel and apologize," Ryan said, each word heavy and distinct, like an order that allowed no refusal. Eli felt the pull at his collar, the discomfort spreading across his chest. He did not resist, nor did he bow, his gaze fixed on Ryan's face, very close now, close enough to clearly see the still youthful features, the confidence that had never been tested. "I once kept Wallace alive with these hands," Eli said slowly. The sentence dropped between them, heavy as a solid object hitting the ground. In that moment, the sound of the rain seemed to fade. Several gazes nearby shifted, curiosity replacing their initial contempt. The name Wallace, spoken again, was no longer a distant title from the news, but a person who had just been laid into the earth. Ryan narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening. "Sounds like some cheap fairy tale," he replied with a mocking tone. "Who do you think is going to believe that?" Eli did not answer right away. He looked at Ryan, his eyes deep and still, like a lake before a storm. Old images drifted through his mind, indistinct, yet sharp enough to tighten his chest. A heavy body being dragged through mud, another hand clamping tightly around his wrist, ragged breathing mingling with distant gunfire. That memory required no explanation. It existed as part of him, regardless of whether anyone else believed it. Ryan yanked Eli closer, his breath blowing straight into Eli's face. "Shut up," he roared. The sound was loud, sharp, and coarse, slicing through the solemn atmosphere of the state funeral. A few people behind them flinched. A young guard stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, his eyes wavering between orders and the rising sense of unease. Eli remained still, his collar still clenched in Ryan's hand, the piece of metal in his palm pressed into his skin, reminding him why he was here. He no longer looked at Ryan. His gaze slid past the young officer's shoulder, toward the interior of the cemetery, where the flag-draped coffin was waiting. An old promise surfaced more clearly than ever, not as sound, but as a crushing weight in his chest. Ryan kept a tight hold on the collar, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and the pleasure of exerting power. "You think you're special," he said, his voice lower, but no less venomous. "Here, everyone follows the rules." The statement was delivered like an unquestionable truth. Eli drew in a deep breath, his shoulders lifted slightly, then fell. He felt each heartbeat clearly, steady and heavy. The metal fragment in his hand seemed to grow warm, even as the cold rain continued to fall. He knew he was standing at a point where every choice carried consequences, and that silence was no longer a solution. Around them, the onlookers began to sense that something was changing. The tension was no longer a minor dispute at the gate. It had reached a deeper level, where honor and memory were being dragged out before the crowd. The flag above continued to sway, each steady motion like a slow count toward what was about to happen. Ryan still gripped Eli's collar, his hand rigid with strain. "Listen carefully," he said, grinding out each word. "You don't belong here." The sentence rang out amid the rain, amid the distant sound of the national anthem, amid the watching eyes. Eli looked straight at Ryan one last time in that moment. The look in his eyes was no longer the earlier forbearance, but a deeper, more frightening stillness. The old oath was still there, but it had been insulted enough to begin cracking. Ryan's grip did not merely pull at his collar. It dragged along the past that Eli had tried to set down for many years. Ryan screamed once more, his voice breaking with rage. "Shut up." Ryan's hand still gripped tightly at Eli's collar, the pull steadily driving him toward the gate, as if trying to shove him beyond the final boundary. The wet stone beneath their feet was slick, making every step heavier. Eli could clearly feel the brutality in each movement. This was no longer about maintaining order, but about punishment for someone who dared to stand in the wrong place. The piece of metal in his hand pressed into his skin, cold and sharp, reminding him of what had just been trampled. Ryan yanked harder. "Move," he snarled, his breathing quick and harsh. A few guards walked alongside them, their expressions tense, as if they themselves were unsure of what they were witnessing. The flag behind them continued to flutter in the wind, steady and indifferent to the conflict that was escalating. Eli followed the pull, but his mind had already drifted elsewhere. In that instant, he saw a familiar face again, not from news broadcasts or portrait photos hanging all over the city, but a living, breathing person, with a weary smile after a long night. A promise surfaced, simple yet heavy. He murmured so quietly it almost dissolved into the sound of rain. "I'm sorry, Wallace." The apology was not for what he was about to do, but for an oath he had tried to keep for many years. Ryan turned his head, his eyes flashing. He released Eli's collar for a split second, his right hand lifting, elbow bending in the instinctive motion of someone who believed he held power. There was no hesitation in the movement, only the confidence of a man who had never been resisted in situations like this. A few people behind them realized what was about to happen, their breathing faltering. Eli's punch exploded forward before anyone could speak, fast, clean, decisive, like a motion etched deep into his body long ago. His hand closed into a fist, force traveling straight from his shoulder down his arm, ending in a precise point of impact. The sound of contact cracked sharply and briefly, overpowering even the rain for that moment. Ryan's body fell backward, losing balance. His eyes flew open, unable to comprehend what had just happened. His body slammed onto the wet stone, his head tilting to one side. He lay there, dazed, one hand trying to push against the ground, but lacking the strength. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, blending into the rainwater spreading across the stone surface. The entire line of soldiers froze. No one rushed forward immediately, as if they had just witnessed something outside of reality. A guard blurted out, his voice unsteady. How did he do that? The question hung in the heavy air, unanswered. Eyes turned toward Eli, filled with a mix of shock and confusion. Eli stood still where he was. The punch seemed to have drained what little strength he had left, yet his face retained a strange calm. He looked at Ryan lying on the ground for a brief beat, then shifted his gaze toward the cemetery gate. There was no triumph, no visible regret, only a heavy acceptance. Shouts followed soon after. Guards moved in at once, hands gripping Eli's shoulder, then his wrist. He did not resist. When the cold handcuffs snapped shut, he remained still, as if this were something inevitable. A young soldier looked at him, confusion still clear in his eyes. "Don't hurt him," he whispered to a fellow guard, his voice uncertain. Ryan was helped into a sitting position. He coughed violently, raised his hand to wipe the corner of his mouth, and saw blood smeared on his glove. His eyes darkened, filled with anger and humiliation. "Arrest him," Ryan said, his voice hoarse. "Get him out, now." The order came out rushed, as if to conceal the shock that had just struck his pride. Eli was led away between two rows of soldiers. Each footstep echoed on the wet stone, steady and heavy. The surrounding crowd parted, forming a narrow path. Some people watched him with curiosity, others turned away. No one spoke, but the silence was thick with questions. In Eli's mind, only one thought remained, clearer than any other sound. He had broken his promise. The oath made long ago, the vow meant to end violence, had now been shattered. He did not justify himself, nor did he try to soothe the feeling. He knew he had chosen, and every choice had its price. As they neared the gate, Ryan struggled to his feet, unsteady but forcing himself to stand straight. Blood still seeped from the corner of his mouth, dripping onto the stone with each step he took. The red stood out against the gray ground, an unmistakable mark. Ryan watched Eli being escorted away, his eyes burning with hatred, but beneath it lay a confusion he had never experienced before. The security gate loomed ahead. Beyond the fence, rain continued to fall steadily. The distant city blurred behind a curtain of water. Eli paused for a moment as the guards adjusted their positions, then continued walking. He did not look back, but he knew he had left behind a fragile, artificial calm. A crack had formed, and it would not be easily sealed. Ryan stood inside, his fists clenched, his jaw tight with pain and rage. Another drop of blood fell, splattering across the cold stone. The scene closed on this moment, Eli being escorted out through the gate, and Ryan's authority, for the first time, revealing its fragility before an unavoidable punch. Eli was led toward the outer gate, in heavy silence. The steady sound of rain tapping against the metal canopy blended with the synchronized footsteps of the escorting soldiers. The cold handcuffs around his wrists were not tightened, but they were enough to remind him that something had just crossed an invisible line. Behind him, the military cemetery maintained the rigid order of the state funeral rows of people standing at attention, the flag swaying gently in the wind, as if the recent conflict were nothing more than a small ripple that had not yet spread. Ryan remained near the inner gate, one hand pressed against his jawline, the other wiping away a streak of blood still clinging to the corner of his mouth. His eyes followed Eli with anger that had yet to subside. Several guards exchanged glances. No one spoke, but everyone sensed that something about this moment was off. That punch had cracked a shell that had seemed unbreakable, and the silence afterward brought no sense of safety. Among those standing near the gate, a young officer watched closely. He did not take part in the escort, nor did he turn away like the others. His gaze lingered on Eli's gait, on the way he kept his back straight despite the cuffs, on the strange calm that did not match someone who had just caused a disturbance. A name surfaced in his mind, unclear yet strong enough to make him hesitate. The young officer raised his hand to the radio. lowering his voice to avoid attention. "Reporting," he said, paused for a brief beat, then continued. "Eli Center." The name was spoken slowly, as if each syllable were being weighed. On the other end, silence stretched for several seconds. There was no reply, only the familiar hiss of static. The young officer held his position, eyes still tracking Eli as he was led a few more steps away. He felt his heartbeat quicken, an unnamed premonition taking shape. The voice from the radio returned, this time sharp and strained. "Confirm immediately," a colonel barked, not concealing the tension. "Who did you say?" The young officer swallowed and repeated the name, more clearly. "Eli Center, sir." Another pause followed, heavier than before. Then a different voice cut in, lower, trembling despite an effort to remain composed. "If that is correct," the voice said, "activate Code Shepherd." The final two words were emphasized, like an order long unused. The young officer lowered the radio, a chill running down his spine. He had never heard of that designation in any training, but the reaction on the other end was enough for him to understand that this was not an administrative error. He glanced at Ryan, then toward the outer gate, where Eli was about to be removed from the state funeral grounds. "Stop," he said, his voice firmer than he expected. Ryan turned, anger still etched across his face. "What did you say?" he snapped. The young officer did not explain. He moved quickly toward Eli, signaling the escort to halt. "Hold position," he said, not loudly, but clearly. The guards looked at one another, then stopped, hesitation visible on their faces. The sound of engines rose from a distance, faint at first, then rapidly growing clearer. Beyond the barricades, a military convoy appeared, moving at high speed while maintaining tight formation. The vehicles came to a precise stop directly in front of the main gate, tires lightly grinding against the wet ground. The air seemed to freeze in that instant. The door of the lead vehicle opened. A man stepped out tall, shoulders squared, every step carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding situations far greater than this. On his shoulders were 4 stars, gleaming faintly through the rain. It was General Michael Peters. His arrival transformed the gate area instantly. Guards snapped to attention on instinct, Ryan included, though surprise still flickered across his face. Peters did not look around. His gaze was fixed directly on Eli. As if nothing else existed, Peters approached and stopped in front of Eli. He raised a hand, signaling the guards. "Remove the cuffs," he said, his voice low and concise. No one questioned him. The handcuffs were unlocked, the cold metal dropping with a soft sound. Eli gently rubbed his wrists, red marks clearly visible beneath the rain. Peters straightened, adjusted his posture in a brief motion, then came to attention. His salute was sharp and exact, carrying the full weight of a lifetime in uniform. Those around him were stunned. A few guards, not yet understanding what was happening, could only stand frozen, eyes wide. Ryan stared at the scene in disbelief. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if held back by an invisible force. "Sir," he said, his voice lowered, "that man just caused a disturbance during the state funeral." Peters did not turn. "I know," he replied calmly. Eli stood before Peters, back straight, arms relaxed at his sides. He said nothing. His eyes passed over the general's face, recognizing a distant familiarity not from ceremonies or meetings, but from something deeper, shared in silence. Peters turned to face Ryan and the guards. The rain continued to fall, light but steady, punctuating every breath in the tense air. "What you just did," Peters said, "was a mistake." His voice was not loud, but it carried a serious mistake. Ryan opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped. His gaze flicked to Eli, then back to Peters. "Sir," he said hoarsely, "I was only following regulations." Peters looked straight at him, his eyes sharp, but not angry. "Regulations do not replace understanding," he replied. A murmur spread among those nearby. The name Eli Center was whispered again, this time without mockery. The young officer stepped back a pace, his heart still racing. He realized he had just touched something far beyond his own rank. Peters drew in a breath, then raised his voice so all could hear. "Eli Center," he said, each word clear, ringing through the space of the state funeral, "is the shepherd." The words fell like a thunderclap, shattering the silence and opening a door no one present had ever expected to see. After General Michael Peters' statement, the military cemetery fell into a very different kind of silence. It was no longer ceremonial solemnity, but the held breath of people who had just realized they were standing before something beyond ordinary understanding. The rain continued to fall, lighter and more even, as if the sky itself had slowed down to observe the unfolding events. Eli stood still for several seconds, clearly sensing the change. The looks from those around him were no longer cold or curious, but cautious and restrained, mixed with an emotion difficult to name. Peters turned slightly, and gave a subtle nod. Two senior officers stepped forward without the need for further words. Eli was escorted into the honor area, his steps slow but steady, as if he were accustomed to moments when the entire space focused its gaze on him. The crowd automatically parted. No one signaled, no one spoke, yet a gap opened very naturally. Those standing nearby stepped back half a step, then another half step. Some lowered their heads, others stood upright but looked away. The way they looked at Eli now was entirely different from just minutes earlier. Suspicion was gone, replaced by the feeling of having suddenly realized they had been standing too close to something far greater. Ryan stood at the edge of the pathway. His face had gone pale, his jaw clenched tight. As Eli passed by, Ryan bowed his head. The gesture happened very quickly, almost reflexively, but it was clear enough for those around to notice. He did not dare look up, did not dare meet the eyes of the man he had just dragged, humiliated, and escorted away like a troublemaker. In that moment, the power Ryan believed he held dissolved rapidly, revealing an unsettling emptiness beneath. Eli did not stop, nor did he look toward Ryan. He continued forward, his gaze fixed ahead, where the flag-draped coffin rested at the center of the honor guard. The distance was not far, yet each step seemed to carry a heavy layer of memory. The sound of rain falling on the fabric of the flag was soft and even, like a slow breath. As Eli approached the central area, a young man stood up from the front row of seats. He had Wallace's eyes and the bridge of his nose, though fatigue was more clearly etched into his face. His gaze settled on Eli, not with curiosity, but with recognition that had existed for a long time. He stepped forward carefully, as if afraid of breaking the stillness that had settled over everything. "My father waited for this moment," he said quietly, just loud enough for Eli to hear. His voice was hoarse, as though it had been held back for far too long. Eli turned to look at him, a silent understanding flickering in his eyes. He did not ask for clarification, nor did he seem surprised. Some statements need no further explanation. Wallace's son extended his hand, holding a thick envelope, its paper edges yellowed by time. A red seal stood out sharply against the gray backdrop of the state funeral. On the front of the envelope, the words Operation Dawnfile were written neatly. Eli took it, the weight in his hand coming not only from the thickness of the documents. "Why now?" Eli asked, his voice low and deep. The question carried no reproach, only the uncertainty of someone who had waited too long for a moment that never seemed to arrive. Wallace's son took a deep breath, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before returning to Eli. "Because today," he said, his voice catching for a brief moment, "no one dares to silence it anymore." The words were spoken slowly, as if each one had to pass through an invisible barrier. Eli gave a slight nod. He looked at the envelope in his hand, then slowly opened it. Inside were carefully arranged stacks of documents, the paper old, but the text still clear. He turned to the first page and lingered there for a long time. The familiar lines appeared, not because he had read them before, but because they aligned perfectly with what he had carried within himself for 40 years. The air around Eli seemed to settle another beat deeper. The sound of rain, footsteps, and all other noises faded farther away. He turned a few more pages, each one revealing a fragment of a story that had never been fully told. Details of an operation, timelines, and reports that were brief, yet cold. His gaze lowered, not from surprise, but from a brutal confirmation. Wallace's son stood beside him, his hand clenched tight. He did not look at the documents, only at Eli's face. He saw the subtle change, the growing heaviness taking shape in the eyes of the man before him. "My father could not speak of it while he was alive," he said softly. He knew he was not strong enough to stand against those people. Eli did not respond right away. He turned another page, then stopped. There, amid the neat, typed lines, a name appeared, standing out as if it lifted itself from the page. His heart slowed for a moment, then sank heavily. Old memories surged up, not clear in image, but vivid in sensation. A hurried meeting, a decision made in the dark, a door slamming shut behind those who never had time to understand what was happening. Eli raised his hand and lightly touched the edge of the paper, as if to be sure he was not mistaken. His lips trembled slightly, so faintly it would have gone unnoticed unless one stood very close. He silently read the name, slowly, each syllable bound to an old wound that had never healed. Harrington. The name echoed in his mind, unspoken, yet strong enough to set the entire past in motion. Eli stood motionless in the honor section, the Dawnfile envelope open in his hands like a door that had been locked for 40 years and had finally been forced open. He turned each page slowly, carefully, as if a single hurried movement might shatter the truth. The lines of text appeared orderly and cold, drafted in dry military language, yet every letter carried the weight of human lives. His hand trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the brutal confirmation gradually taking shape in his mind. The first page spoke of the plan. The next was a deployment diagram. Then came the post-war reports, brief to the point of cruelty, where casualty figures were recorded as neatly as statistics. Eli stopped at a handwritten note, the familiar handwriting standing out clearly against the yellowed paper. It was Wallace's writing. He recognized it immediately, without needing to look closely. A short sentence was underlined. "He is being protected." The sound of that sentence echoed in Eli's head, not as written words, but as a voice, Wallace's voice, low and hoarse, like during long, sleepless nights. Eli closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling his chest tighten. "You carried this alone," he whispered, the words dissolving into the damp air of the cemetery. No one heard it, but he knew Wallace had been hearing it for 40 years. Eli turned another page. The pages that followed no longer concealed anything. The chain of events was laid out clearly, from the moment information was leaked to the instant the Special Operations Unit fell into a carefully calculated ambush. It was not a tactical mistake, not bad weather, not a rushed decision. Everything pointed in one single direction. Someone had opened the door from the inside, pushed them toward death, then slammed it shut. The air around Eli seemed heavier. The rain continued to fall steadily, but now he could hear his own heartbeat, slow and deep. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping across the honor section. In the far corner, among the seats of high-ranking officials, a man adjusted his tie, a small, familiar movement, almost unconscious. Minister Harrington. His face was calm, the kind of calm worn by someone accustomed to sitting in places where all eyes are forced to be cautious. Harrington tilted his head, leaned toward the person beside him, and murmured very softly, "It's all over now." The words were not directed at anyone in particular, as if meant only to reassure himself. Eli watched him, his gaze locking on without concealment. In that moment, every piece in his mind clicked perfectly into place. The meetings were canceled at the last minute, the vague orders, the doors that had opened, and then slammed shut when he and Wallace tried to trace the truth. Peters stood not far from Eli. He noticed the change on the man's face before him. Very subtle, yet unmistakable. A cold focus, entirely different from the earlier weariness. Peters did not ask. Years of experience had taught him that there are moments when it is best to let someone reach their own conclusions. Eli bent down again, his hand flipping to the final section of the file. A small recording device was attached inside the envelope. He pressed the button. The sound was slightly distorted at first. Then Wallace's voice came through, low and slow, as if he had weighed every word for a long time before speaking. "If I die first." The voice paused for a beat, long enough for the listener to feel the hesitation behind it. Eli closed his eyes. Wallace's voice continued, steadier now. "I couldn't fight him. There's a committee behind him, and I didn't have the strength to break it while I was still alive." Each word struck like a hammer against old memories. Eli recalled the times Wallace fell silent when he should have spoken, the times he changed the subject when the questions came too close to the truth. The recording grew clearer, as if Wallace had decided to say everything. "Eli, if you're hearing this, it means I'm no longer there to keep things under control." A soft breath followed. "I'm sorry for making you carry those questions for so long." Eli opened his eyes. Before him, the military cemetery still held its solemn composure, but in his mind, a storm was forming. He looked toward Harrington again. The man sat upright, both hands resting on his thighs, his composure carefully maintained, but Eli had seen it now, a very small crack in that confidence, something that only appeared when the gaze of someone who knew too much locked onto him. Peters stepped a little closer, standing beside Eli. He did not look at the documents, only at Eli's face. "Are you all right?" Peters asked quietly. Eli did not turn his head, only nodded very slightly. "I need to hear all of it," he replied, his voice low. Wallace's voice sounded again from the recording device. "If I die first, open the truth at the right moment." The sentence was emphasized, not by volume, but by certainty, at the right moment, so no one can bury it again. Eli tightened his grip on the device. He understood that Wallace had not chosen today by chance, a state funeral, where all eyes were focused on a single point, where even the most powerful figures were forced to appear in public. No more dark corners, no more private corridors for retreat. Wallace had placed the truth in the right place, at the right time, and handed it to the right person. Harrington seemed to sense something. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the honor section before stopping on Eli. For a brief second, his calm vanished, replaced by a very real unease. Eli met his gaze directly, without avoidance. No words were needed. That confrontation alone was enough for both men to understand that the game had shifted. Peters sensed the tension rising rapidly. He glanced toward the security area, then back at Eli. "What are you going to do?" Peters asked, his voice more serious this time. Eli lowered the recording device, his eyes never leaving Harrington. "I will do what Wallace could not," he said, his voice low but clear. The rain began to fall more heavily, striking the white headstones around them, as if marking the rhythm of something about to happen. The cemetery remained quiet, but this silence was no longer harmless. It stretched taut, waiting for a single touch to shatter it. Wallace's voice still echoed in Eli's ears now, no longer through the device, but as if rising from deep within memory. "Open the truth at the right moment. If the truth has been buried for 40 years, who will dare to pull it into the light?" The warning bell rang out, short and sharp, cutting through the solemn atmosphere, just as the funeral ceremony was about to begin. The sound was not loud, but it was enough to make many heads turn at the same time. It carried an urgency familiar to those who had once served in the military, a signal that something had slipped beyond control. Harrington sprang to his feet from the row reserved for delegates. His movement was far too fast for the overall rhythm, making its abnormality immediately apparent. The chair behind him scraped lightly against the stone floor, producing a dry sound. An officer standing nearby turned toward him, reacting out of duty. "Where are you going?" the man shouted, his voice echoing through what had moments before been a quiet space. Harrington did not stop. He spun around, his face draining of color for an instant, before quickly shifting into another expression, rigid and fierce. "Get out of the way," Harrington growled, his voice hoarse but sharp. His arm swung hard, shoving the officer aside. The familiar air of refinement vanished, revealing another man beneath it, rough and desperate. In just a few brief seconds, everything slipped off course. Harrington reached into his coat and pulled out a handgun. The metal flashed under the gray light of the state funeral. A few shrill cries rang out from behind him. Harrington raised the gun, his hand trembling slightly, but his eyes filled with resolve. It was all to climb higher. He shouted, his voice breaking. "Do you think I had any other choice?" The crowd panicked. Those seated in the front rows jumped to their feet, retreating in chaos. The pounding of footsteps, the scraping of overturned chairs, and shouted names blended into one another, mixed with the sound of rain that had begun to fall more heavily. Guards immediately spread out in reflexive formation, weapons raised, but no one fired. The distance was too close, too many civilians were present, and every decision had to be weighed in an instant. Peters stood upright, his voice cutting clearly through the chaos. "Surround him," he barked. The order was relayed at once. Security units moved, forming a tightening arc. Harrington glanced around, wild calculation flashing in his eyes. He knew there was no way back, and that realization pushed him forward. Harrington turned and charged toward the memorial tower of the unknown soldier. It was a tall structure of gray stone, set slightly apart from the main ceremonial area, like a solitary marker amid the cemetery. He did not run fast, but he ran with determination, as if every step were driven by the fear of being captured right there, in front of everyone. Eli stood in the ceremonial area, witnessing the scene in a strange stillness. He did not run after Harrington right away. His eyes followed him, unblinking. In that moment, everything around him seemed to slow. He could hear each raindrop distinctly. The chaotic footsteps of the retreating crowd faded into the distance. In his mind, old images surfaced, not in chronological order, but bound by feeling. Eli remembered the faces of the special operations team, the ones who never came back. He remembered the vague reports, the evasive answers. He remembered Wallace, with the weary look in his eyes whenever conversations drifted too close to the truth. All of it converged on the image of Harrington fleeing ahead, a man who had placed personal ambition above the lives of an entire unit. Peters moved closer to Eli, his voice lowered but still tense. "We'll handle this," he said, his eyes still tracking the moving teams. "You stay here." It was an instinctive command, meant to keep Eli away from the escalating danger. Eli did not turn to look at Peters. "He won't stop," he said, his voice deep and firm. "He's gone too far." Peters looked at Eli and noticed something in his eyes, an unusual calm amid the chaos. It was not the calm of someone standing aside, but of someone who had lived through far worse situations. Harrington reached the base of the memorial tower and glanced back for a moment. He saw the security teams closing in. saw the gun barrels pointed at him, sweat mixed with rain on his forehead, yet his eyes still burned with stubborn defiance. "Nobody come closer," Harrington screamed, the gun shaking in his hand. "I'll shoot." A few guards stopped, maintaining the prescribed distance. Peters raised a hand, signaling everyone to hold position. The situation became more fragile than ever. One slip of a finger, one hasty decision, and blood would spill right there in the cemetery. Eli stepped forward one pace. The movement was small, but enough for Peters to notice. "Eli," Peters said, his voice warning. Eli raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "Let me," Eli said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a certainty that made Peters hesitate. Eli took another step, moving out of the ceremonial area toward the memorial tower. The crowd behind him seemed to sense the change, the noise diminishing. Harrington saw Eli, and a flash of belated recognition crossed his face. "It's you," Harrington said, his voice trembling. "You should have died with them." Eli did not stop. He walked slowly and steadily, keeping a safe distance. "You don't need to run," Eli said, his voice low. "You've been running for 40 years. There was no anger in the words, only cold judgment, which unsettled Harrington more than any threat. Harrington let out a broken, bitter laugh. "You don't understand," he said. "If I hadn't done it, I would have died." The gun remained pointed at Eli, his hand shaking more violently. "I only did what had to be done." Had to be done for whom, Eli asked, stopping. "For you, or for those who died in your place?" The question hung heavily between them. Harrington did not answer. His eyes flicked toward the security teams, then back to Eli. Desperation laid bare. Peters watched the scene, realizing that everything was moving toward an outcome that could no longer be stopped. He signaled the teams to hold their positions, not to advance. Trust was placed in Eli, even though it ran counter to every standard security procedure. Harrington took another step back, his spine touching the steps of the memorial tower. Behind him were names carved into the stone, those who had sacrificed their lives. The irony of the situation was unmistakable. "Don't think you're a hero," Harrington shouted. "You survived, too." Eli looked up at the carved names, then back at Harrington. "I survived to bring them home," he said. "You survived to climb higher." The words fell with finality, needing nothing more. Harrington tightened his grip on the gun, his breathing rapid, the air stretched taut like a wire about to snap. Eli took one final step forward, standing firmly in the open space that the crowd and the security teams had unconsciously left for him. He looked straight at Harrington, his gaze unwavering. "I will take him back," Eli said, slowly, his voice carrying far enough for Peters and those nearby to hear. "No one else dies." The memorial tower to the unknown soldiers stood looming in the heavy rain, its cold gray stone blocks covered with the names of the fallen. The space around it seemed to have all sound drained away, as if every noise of the cemetery had been pushed far back. Harrington turned around, his back pressing against the stone steps, the gun in his hand, visibly trembling. His eyes darted rapidly, instinctively, searching for an escape route, then stopped when he realized that ahead there was only one path left straight toward Eli. He let out a scream, his voice cracked and sharp, as if trying to use sheer volume to drown out the fear surging inside him. "You should have died," Harrington shouted, his breath breaking apart. The words burst out like a curse, aimed not only at Eli, but at everything he had buried deep beneath layers of power and compromise. Eli stood still, the distance between them held just close enough for their eyes to meet directly. Rain clung to his shoulders, seeped into his collar, and ran down along the wrinkles of a face shaped by far too many years. "You live off their bodies," Eli said, his voice low and steady. The words were not loud, but each syllable was heavy, falling onto the stone like cold pebbles. Harrington laughed, a hoarse, hurried sound, mixed with desperation. "If I hadn't sold them out, I would have died," he screamed, the hand holding the gun jerking hard, the barrel swinging off target, and then back toward Eli. "You think I had a choice?" His eyes were bloodshot, like a cornered animal. Eli did not step forward, nor did he retreat. He looked at Harrington, his gaze deep and calm, without pity and without visible anger. "And you call that living?" he asked. The question was gentle, yet sharp enough to cut into the thin defenses Harrington still had left. Harrington panted, his chest heaving violently. Sweat mixed with rain ran down his temples. He glanced at the names carved into the stone behind him, then turned back to Eli, his eyes wavering between hatred and fear. "You don't understand," he said, his voice lower now, trembling. "They're dead. I'm not." Eli looked up at the memorial tower for a brief moment. The names were lined up without rank, without title. He remembered every face, every voice, every fleeting moment, before everything collapsed. They died believing someone had their backs, Eli said, turning back to Harrington. You were that person. Harrington shook his head, as if trying to shake off the accusation hanging in the air. I did what was necessary, he said, his voice turning sharp again. This entire system is built on compromises. You think you stand outside of it. He raised the gun higher, his arm shaking, but his finger tightening on the trigger. From a distance, Peters stood with the security teams, keeping their distance, exactly as Eli had signaled. No one advanced, no one fired. All eyes were fixed on the open space by the memorial tower, where two people faced each other, where 40 years of history were being forced to speak the truth. Eli felt his heartbeat clearly, steady and slow. He knew that every passing second could decide the lives of many. You're afraid, Eli said, his voice even lower. Not because you'll be arrested. You're afraid to face what you've done. The words were like a thin blade, slipping past the rage to strike the weakness Harrington tried to hide. Harrington screamed, a throat-tearing cry. Shut up, he roared, the gun shaking violently. You think I lost nothing? I traded everything. He stepped back half a step, his heel hitting the stone step, nearly slipping. I can't go back anymore. Eli took a single slow step forward, a small movement, but enough to make Harrington flinch. None of them ever had a chance to go back, Eli said. You still do. He stopped, keeping the distance, applying no pressure. Lower the gun. Harrington shook his head harder. It's too late, he said, his voice breaking. Far too late. His eyes flicked toward the gun barrels aimed from afar, then returned to Eli. A desperate calculation surfaced. He clenched his jaw, rain dripping from his chin, mixing with sweat and tears that had no time to fall. Eli saw that moment, the moment when a person realizes every exit has closed. He did not raise his hands, did not soften his voice. He simply stood there, solid as a marker. Don't do this, Eli said. You don't need to kill anyone else to preserve your story. Harrington let out a dry, broken laugh. My story, he asked. There's no story left. He lifted the gun higher. The barrel pointed straight at Eli. His hand trembled, but the resolve in his eyes was unmistakable. If I go down, you're coming with me. Time seemed to slow. The sound of the rain became distinct, each drop audible. Those standing far away held their breath. Peters raised his hand instinctively, then stopped, trusting the distance and Eli's control. All eyes were locked on Harrington's finger resting on the trigger. Eli stood still, not dodging. His gaze never left Harrington, not in defiance, but in absolute focus. In that moment, he saw Wallace again, saw those who had fallen, saw the promise, never spoken aloud. He was ready to bear responsibility for his choice, as he had done before. Harrington drew in a long breath, his chest rising and falling. You think you've won? He asked, his voice hoarse. You haven't won anything. His finger tightened further, the tendons standing out beneath taut skin. Eli replied with a short sentence, meant only for Harrington to hear. I didn't come to win, he said. I came to end it. In the next instant, Harrington screamed, pouring every remaining ounce of strength into the sound. His finger pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out. The bullet tore through the air with a clean, ripping sound, struck Eli's shoulder, then glanced off, leaving behind a long, burning trail. The impact forced him down onto one knee, one hand bracing against the wet stone. Blood quickly soaked through his clothing, mixing with the rain and spreading into a dark stain. The pain flared sharp and deep, but it was not enough to extinguish the clarity forged over a lifetime spent facing death. Harrington did not stop to check. He turned and fled, his footing slipping on the stone steps, his breathing ragged. Panic showed in every movement, nothing like the false confidence he had worn moments before. The gun remained in his hand, but his arm shook so badly that the barrel wavered, no longer aimed at anything in particular. He only wanted to get away, away from this place, away from the names carved into stone that seemed to stare straight into his back. Eli bowed his head for a brief beat, feeling the warm blood run down his upper arm. He did not groan, nor did he curse. His free hand slid into his chest pocket and closed around the familiar piece of metal. The twisted pin, cold and heavy, fit neatly in his palm. The scratches along its surface bit into his skin, carrying with them the memory of another moment, one filled with explosions and smoke that blotted out the sky. David, lend me your strength, Eli whispered, very softly. The words dissolved into the rain, needing no other ears to hear them. It was not a plea, but the renewal of a bond that had never been broken. He drew in a deep breath, letting the pain settle beneath his practiced control. Eli pushed himself upright in half emotion, precision, precise and economical, as if his body had remembered an old rhythm on its own. He surged forward, not with reckless speed, but along the shortest, most efficient path. Harrington heard footsteps behind him and turned in panic. His eyes widened as he realized the distance had closed far faster than he had expected. Harrington raised his arm on instinct, the gun jerking wildly. Eli closed in at exactly the right moment, knocking aside the gun hand with a short, decisive movement. Metal struck stone with a dry crack. The weapon flew free, skidded several meters, and came to rest at the base of the memorial tower. Harrington screamed, pain and terror blending, his numbed hand hanging uselessly at his side. Eli gave him no time. He twisted his wrist, the pin held firmly between his fingers, and drove it straight into a nerve point at Harrington's shoulder. The force was not great, but it was exact. Harrington screamed, high and broken, his entire body sagging as if all strength had been drained from it. His knees buckled, the other hand reaching out weakly, no longer under his control. The rain fell harder, hammering against stone and the two struggling bodies. Eli held the position for a single beat, long enough to be certain Harrington could not continue. His breathing quickened, the pain in his shoulder reminding him that time was not on his side. Still, his gaze remained focused, never leaving the man before him. Security teams began advancing from a distance, but Peters raised a hand, signaling them to hold back. He understood that these seconds required a clean ending, without added chaos. Gun barrels lowered gradually, all eyes fixed on the two figures before the memorial tower. Harrington panted, sweat mixing with rain, as it streamed down a face twisted by pain and fear. He forced his head up, bloodshot eyes glaring at Eli with the last traces of weak hatred. "Do you think this is over?" he hissed, his voice trembling. "You can't change anything." Eli bent lower, keeping just enough distance for Harrington to hear every word. The pin was still in his hand, slick with blood and rain. "I didn't come to change the past," Eli said, his voice low. "I came to end the lie." He applied a slight additional pressure, just enough to make Harrington falter, his breath breaking. Harrington screamed again, but the sound was weaker, drained of strength. His body collapsed forward completely, held in place by Eli in a kneeling position on the cold stone. The gun lay several meters away, harmless now, reflecting the pale gray of the sky. The names carved into the stone behind them stood silent, bearing witness as 40 years of silence were torn apart. Eli leaned in, close to Harrington's ear. His voice was low, meant for only one listener. "You were taken down by the very thing that almost killed Wallace," he said. The words carried no triumph, only a truth restored to its proper place. Harrington shuddered, then finally went limp, his last resistance dissolving. Peters gave the signal. The security teams moved in at once, cuffing Harrington with efficient silence. There were no shouted commands, no unnecessary collisions. Everything happened quickly, as if all understood that this moment required a decisive conclusion. Harrington was hauled to his feet, his steps unsteady, his eyes hollow. Eli stepped back once, the pain in his shoulder forcing him to stop and brace a hand against the stone step to steady himself. Blood still soaked through his clothing, but the flow had slowed. Peters approached and stood beside him. "You're wounded," Peters said quietly. Eli gave a small nod. "It's fine," he replied. "It's over." From a distance, the crowd stood still, no longer panicked. This silence was different from the ones before. It carried a sense of closure, like a final door being shut behind them. The rain began to ease, the drops growing farther apart, as though the sky itself had said enough. Eli looked toward the memorial tower, then down at the pin in his hand. He turned it slightly, feeling the familiar scratches. The old memories settled, no longer surging as they once had. He placed the pin back into his pocket, where it belonged, no longer a weapon, but a witness that had fulfilled its final role. Harrington was led away without looking back. The security teams dispersed, returning the space to the cemetery. Peters rested a hand briefly on Eli's shoulder, then signaled for medical personnel to approach. Eli stood straight, though every movement pulled at the pain. He looked toward the flag-draped coffin, his expression softening, as if setting down a burden he had carried for far too long. The rain thinned until only scattered drops remained. The space around the memorial tower grew quiet. The story was not finished, but an essential chapter had closed with a twisted piece of metal restoring justice to those who had fallen. Harrington was handcuffed in absolute silence. There were no more shouts, No more justifications. His wrists were held in front of his abdomen, the metal closing neatly and decisively. The eyes that had once been sharp and cold were now empty, staring into the void ahead, as if every escape route had vanished along with the lies. Security teams escorted him away from the memorial tower, each step heavy, no one saying another word. The truth was already standing there, needing no argument. Eli returned to the cemetery once all movement had settled. His shoulder was still bleeding, the blood seeping through his clothing and mixing with the rainwater lingering on the stone ground. He walked slowly, but steadily. The pain in his shoulder did not stop him. It merely reminded him that he was still alive, that what had just happened was not some vague memory. Peters walked with him for a short distance, then stopped and signaled for medical personnel to come forward. Eli shook his head very slightly. He wanted to keep going, to complete the final task before allowing anyone else to touch his wound. When Eli entered the central area, 3 guards straightened instinctively. They stood at attention and saluted in unison. The movement was not showy. There was no shouted command, but it was clear enough to express what none of them had understood just a few hours earlier. Eli paused for a brief beat and nodded in return. No reproach was voiced, and no forgiveness was spoken. That moment closed a circle, where initial contempt had given way to belated respect. The cemetery returned to the rhythm of the funeral. The national anthem played once more, slow and solemn. Rows of people stood at attention, the flag covering David Wallace's coffin fluttering gently in the wind. Eli stepped closer and stopped in front of the coffin. He placed his hand on the fabric, feeling the coolness seep into his palm. "I finally made it," he said quietly, just loud enough for himself to hear. It was not an apology, but a confirmation that the promise had been kept. Wallace's son stood a few steps away, silent. He handed Eli a thinner, older envelope, its edges lightly worn. Eli opened it. Inside was a battlefield map, yellowed with age, its folds deeply etched by time. He spread the map out on a nearby surface, his hand slowly tracing the lines and familiar symbols. Red markers stood out, matching the place where everything had begun and also where everything had nearly ended. In the corner of the map, Wallace's handwriting appeared, brief and handwritten. "Everything is enough." The script was not ornate, but firm. Eli stared at the words for a long time. The years of waiting, the unanswered questions, the unfinished conversations all seemed to settle in that moment. Wallace had prepared everything so that the truth could be fully revealed, so that no one would have to carry unfinished work any longer. Eli folded the map, carefully, as if putting away a part of his life. He placed it back into the envelope and handed it to Wallace's son. "Keep it," he said. "Put it where it belongs." The young man nodded, his eyes reddened, unable to speak. The silence between them was fuller than any words of thanks. The rain had stopped. The sky was pale gray, thin clouds drifting slowly, revealing a faint brightness in the distance. Eli looked up and took a deep breath. The air was damp and cold, but more comfortable than before. He felt a strange sense of relief, not because everything had ended neatly, but because the weight of 40 years had finally been set down. Around him, the funeral moved toward its final rites, steady footsteps, precise movements, everything returning to its familiar order. But for Eli, that order now carried a different meaning. It was no longer a barrier, but a place where promises were fulfilled. He turned his back on the coffin and walked slowly toward the exit. Each step no longer felt as heavy as before. Peters approached and stood beside him for a short while. "You should let the medics take care of your wound," Peters said. Eli nodded. "After I leave here," he replied. Peters looked at Eli, his gaze mixed with respect and understanding. "Thank you," Peters said. Eli did not respond immediately. He simply nodded again, as if that gratitude belonged to those who were no longer standing here. As Eli passed through the gate, several people in the crowd turned to watch him go. There was no curiosity left, no whispering, only lowered gazes, recognizing that they had just witnessed something not easily repeated. The 3 guards from earlier were still standing there, holding their rigid posture. Eli walked past without stopping, but there was a new calmness in his stride. He stopped at the edge of the cemetery and turned back for one last look. Rows of white graves lay in order, names engraved in silent stone. The rain had completely ceased. Eli whispered, his voice very soft, yet clear to himself. "David, you can rest now." The words closed a long journey, needing no one else to hear them. Eli stepped away, merging into the pale gray space of the afternoon. The burden had been set down, the truth had been returned to those who had fallen, and the promise between 2 soldiers, 2 friends, had been fully kept. The truth had been returned. But do you think the price paid was enough. The story ends here, among white rows of graves and a pale gray sky. There are no more gunshots, no more orders, no more buried secrets, only the truth, restored to its rightful place, and one final promise fulfilled. Yet perhaps what lingers longest is not victory or defeat, but the question this story leaves with each of us. If the truth can be buried for 40 years, if honor can be misunderstood simply because of power and procedure, then what will make you stand up when it is your turn to choose? If you felt this story, if you believe that stories of honor, truth, and humanity deserve to be told, follow and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the journeys ahead. Each follow you give is a way for untold stories to gain another chance to be heard. Thank you for staying until the very last moment, and see you again in the next story.